The Great Emptiness. They all think me mad, but I know it to be true. In fact, I don't know if they genuinely believe my mind to be gone, or if the truth frightens them as much as it does me. And that's why they've locked me away. They know me to be the harbinger of the ever-present void, and so they lock me away in a cell so that my grave knowledge doesn't infect the minds of the mindless. They lock me away to avoid the inevitable resurgence of the true state of eternity. I was just as you, blissfully ignorant in a world where ignorance is ignorantly designated as a near sin. Never was I appreciative of just how valuable a virtue ignorance could be. The shame of not knowing hangs heavy in the minds of men. It's equated to stupidity. You are less than if you don't know what you had no way of knowing. It's a fundamentally flawed way of thinking, but I subscribed to the same school of thought before I stumbled into the pit of foul knowledge I now find myself engulfed in. It started on a rain-soaked fall afternoon in the woods just behind the sleepy village of Bullinsmith, a place which has since seemed to simply dissipate into nothingness. Even the image of Bullinsmith seems to slip my mind as I try to imagine it. I can picture a tavern, which my mind clumsily remembers as Bullinsmith Tavern, a name that I'm not sure it actually bared, a name that I believe my mind has conjured to fill the hole left by the real name of the tavern. And I can picture the barkeeper, who smiled warmly to his patrons before I pushed open the door on that rainy night, and then seemed to fall silent. Not just his laughter, but his face seemed to fall silent with it, all joy draining, and what was left was expressionless indifference that I later learned must have been masking an instant dread as he saw a dripping wet stranger standing in his doorway. I remember collecting that Bullinsmith wasn't the type of place to draw visitors. In fact, it seemed constructed perfectly to avoid the company of weary travelers. I remember it sat deep in the dead wood of the countryside in a particularly glum region, tucked away like some terrible secret awaiting emergence. I don't recall exactly everyone in the tavern, not even everyone I spoke to, which I guess must have been at least a few people, since I do remember the tavern was especially busy on that night. But I do remember that barkeeper with the grave intensity staring at me in his doorway like a disappointing revelation. I remember Bullinsmith was a small village, but I can't seem to recall anything but that tavern, as if my eyes had tunneled themselves exclusively to it. Even more, the tunnel directly shot from the entrance of the village and starkly cut into the front door of the tavern into the eyes of the dismayed barkeeper. I remember vague warnings, but I don't recall who they came from. In fact, I don't recall if they were verbal messages at all, or if all the warning I needed came from that old man's expression. I would like to tell you I recalled having a few pints at the tavern before retreating into the cold of the November rainfall, but that's not what I remember at all. I remember seeing his face as I stepped in that doorway and turning to leave as soon as I had arrived. But then who could really say what transpired in that village of Bullinsmith? Surely not I. My memory picks up again after leaving the village limits, as if Bullinsmith itself was engulfed in a fog so thick that it would obscure even memory. The road out of Bullinsmith was so gelatinously muddy that my boots sunk nearly to the ankle with every step I took on it. The forest was as dead as a man with pennies on his eyes, and though the leaves didn't encroach on the space of the road, they littered the forest floor just outside the road's boundaries, starting in the ditch which the road dipped off to. I remember now that my excursion was a hunt, but upon leaving Bullinsmith, I found myself momentarily puzzled at why my gloved hands bared a rifle. That was until I heard the first of the owls I would hear that night. As I found myself reaching far enough along the road that the shadowy village of Bullinsmith became a blotted memory, I heard it from the trees. Hoot, hoot, it called. The brain smog lifted from my intentions as I felt my grip tighten around the rifle. That was right, I was there to hunt. But why had I traveled all the way into the dead wood beside Bullinsmith to do it? I didn't know yet. I couldn't remember. But as I delved deeper and deeper, the clearer the memories became from before my venture into the village. The fog of before the village hung heavily in my mind like a waterlogged cloak. But I had begun to rationalize to myself. The wood around the village had been drier than normal, I had thought. It was only natural that I ventured further than I ever had before to find prey. I had no recollection of what prey I thought may be here, but I distinctly remember there being a specific reason that I chose this region to hunt. That was no matter to me then. I had heard the call of an owl, and to my estranged mind, so riddled with obscurity, the owl was my prey. I stopped in my tracks as the owl hooted the first time, and my ears perked to listen. There were at least 2 minutes where I had stood motionless and silent before I had moved again, only doing so as I heard the beckoning hoot, hoot. It was coming from a ways off the road to the right, and so, with my rifle at a low ready, I proceeded on my journey, off the muddy road and into the tree line. The heavy raindrops masked my footsteps as I tromped through the mass grave of fallen leaves toward where I had heard the sound coming from. I ventured for some time into the darkness, as I thought the owl had sounded from a good ways off, before I heard another hoot, hoot. This time, it sounded from behind me, the way I had just come from. It wasn't beyond the realm of possibility for it to have flown to a different tree branch upon seeing my approach, and so I began the way I came. This time slower, more carefully. I treaded lightly as a mouse snagging food from a trap. I walked on, back in the direction I had entered from, and eventually, with no sound off from my owl friend, found myself conscious of the fact that I had wandered much further than I should have had to wander to find my way back to the road. Did I miss it? Have I already walked over the road and entered the other side of the tree line? The thought struck my mind as genuine possibilities in my dense confusion, but as I know now, there was no way I could have missed the road. One doesn't walk thoughtlessly over a solid strip of mud without slipping and stumbling, and I remember just fine that for the last what was probably 20 minutes on end, I was venturing in the same direction. I had never been lost before, and I felt a lump of dread form itself inside of me as the realization washed over me. I had no idea where I was. I had heard but 2 hoots of an owl, and I had gotten myself so turned around that I couldn't possibly know what direction I would need to go to head back to the road. Or even, if I made it to the road, which way I would have to walk to end back up in Bullinsmith. My God. I pressed my hand against my face, then ran it up to my hair where I slicked it back. It was then, after my blasphemy, that I heard the owl sound again from an entirely different direction. This time, as the owl sounded though, the tone was different. Both of the previous calls were very clear and average exclamations. Hoot, hoot, they had echoed. But not this one. In addition to the change of tone, the sound itself seemed to change as well. These didn't sound like the hoots of an owl. These sounded like a word of man spoken by an owl. This call seemed to be questioning me, as if to say, "Who? Who?" I felt a chill shoot up my spine like a shot from a gun. My eyes darted wildly around the dark forest, dimly illuminated by the full moon which peeked out from behind the looming storm clouds. The calls were just different enough. They were just not right enough that they triggered something inside of me. They evoked such fear of the uncanny, and as I allowed my eyes to whip from tree limb to tree limb, hoping to find the owl who made the call, the feeling only mounted. The silence after the call infested me. It was deafening in a way that I had never found a silence to be. It was a sound all its own. I cautiously moved forward, but the noise played again and again, not cutting through the bitter air, but cutting through my mind, the reverberations still bouncing off the interior of my skull. Who? 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 Who's man enough? The gruff voice echoed through my memory like the thunderous clap of creation. It was then that I remembered why I had ventured through Bullinsmith. There was something in the dead wood which surrounded the sleepy village of Bullinsmith, was what he had told me. That night, I had been drinking at a pub called Queen's Bell in a village that was 2-hour venture by horseback from Bullinsmith called Portshire. As I had been throwing back the last swigs of my ale, the door burst open. A rough-looking man, the one who had opened them. That is what he had called as the doors opened. Who's man enough? In a room full of men who held themselves to be quite the manly men. It was a statement he knew would catch the attention of them all. As he described the terrible task the men would have to accomplish to earn their bounty, however, one by one, the men wandered back to their drinks, for they too had heard the tales of the beast which hunted in the dead wood beside Bullinsmith. He had told me there was a creature that was slaying hunters and trappers in the area. He had told me 5 men had vanished in these woods already, and that they were willing to pay good money to any man who would vanquish the beast. Never the superstitious man, I had volunteered. He had been offering enough money to buy my way for 6 months. I had only half believed him to begin with. I didn't know what was to transpire as I came upon the village. I only knew that if there really was some great snarling beast, that I was to be the one to kill it. I was overtaken with a newfound belief that they were not tall tales. What I had heard about the dead wood, but more so, I was overtaken with the terror of knowing that this beast, whatever it was surely hunting me. Whatever it was surely responsible for the shroud that had hung so heavily in my mind, and the shroud that still hangs in my mind when I tried to picture Bullinsmith. My throat developed a lump so present it was physically suffocating. I gasped, only small bits of air making it down my windpipe with each inhalation, as if there were a physical blockage of most of my airway, only leaving free just enough of a gap to allow me to remain conscious. Both of my hands clung to my rifle, as tight as a dying man clings to his last moments of life, as I felt giant, studying eyes watching my every move. "Who's there?" I screamed into the night like a banshee, and just after the echo of my scream dissipated into the distance, the terrible eldritch call floated from the darkness once again. Who? Who? The call was distinctly now a set of who instead of the ubiquitous hoots of an owl, but the tone had yet again shifted, and now seemed to be mocking my desperate call to the phantom voice. I tremored as a small child with a fever would as I heard the terrible thing's mockery, but unsure of what else to do and no longer wanting to be locked in the same position as I had been for upwards of 10 minutes to that point, having allowed fear to freeze me, I pressed onward in the direction of its call. I shoved my rifle into the crevice of my shoulder and pointed it just vaguely ahead of me, my eyes darting around too wildly to be scanning the forest behind the bead which sat on the front of it. I walked and I walked, knees vibrating with debilitating terror, until finally I had gone far enough in one direction that I came upon an opening in the hillside. It opened up as wide as a whale's gullet, and it was as dark as the ocean's depths. As I stepped into the great cave, I began to fumble around in the pack I had dangling from my belt, searching for the matches I had in it. I refused to take one step further until I had a match lit, of which there were still many in my pack. A fortunate thing, too, because the blackness in this cave was all-encompassing. Finally, as I found the box of matches and struck one on the interior of the cave wall, a call sounded from deep in the bowels of the cave. Who? Who? This time, the calls were an unfamiliar tone, or perhaps just a massively unexpected one. They were ones of curiosity, or maybe even confusion. They rang out from deep inside, and I foolishly followed them. My matchstick barely illuminated any of the cave at all, and so as my foot pushed into something soft, at least soft in relativity to the rest of the cave's stony interior, I let out a screeching howl, dropping the match from the hand which I had grasped it in, and swinging backwards with the other hand, which still held the rifle. No, 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 I repeated to myself until I was able to get another match lit, at which time I breathed the most audible sigh of relief I was to ever breathe at the return of what limited light it offered. But the relief would soon flood out of my gut as quickly as it had poured in when I bent over to illuminate what I had ran my foot into. The sinister glow of the match's flame revealed what somehow I knew it would. First, the dim glow showed his face, twisted to an expression of unknowable torment even in death. Then I scanned the light down the length of the cold corpse of one of the 5 men that the thing had claimed. His clothing was in perfect condition, though caked in dust, and it didn't appear to have injured him in any way. There were no ripping claw wounds or gaping bite marks from where its despicable jaws had descended upon his soft flesh. There was nothing at all to suggest an attack of any kind. On his face, though, hung the most anguished expression a human face could manifest, and so strong was the anguish that it stayed with him in death. Who? It drew me onwards. As I delved deeper into the cave, I found the other men, in just the same way I had found the first. They were stiff as a board, untouched by any remnants of a physical attack, and their faces told stories of a horrifying agony, each of their corpses seeming to be perfectly preserved, save for layers of caked-on dust. As I passed the 5th man, I experienced a horror that would shatter my mind forever in ways that I had never thought possible. As I walked past the 5th dead man, the darkness seemed to swallow up my match, not put it out, but swallow it. I could still feel the flame eating away at my fingertips and progressing downward on the matchstick, but the glow from the flame was gone. I felt my body freeze as I was overcome by the impossible dark. Not freeze as in the sense of freezing in fear, but freeze as does a man in death, unable to move, unable to scream, The only movement I could feel overtake my body were the wild contortions my face was making, twisting into a look of horrific suffering as the rigor mortis-like stiffness ravaged my body. Finally, I was able to just barely choke out 2 more words. "My God," I whispered, my throat barely allowing the vocalization. Just then, I heard a voice from the darkness, but not one that was physically present. This voice came from the bowels of darkness itself. It came from a place that lives in non-existence, and in a deep, evil whisper, I heard it say, "Your God is a lie." With just as much sudden power as I had been frozen in place, I regained control of my body and pushed myself with more power and more speed and more veracity out of that cave than I had ever ran from anywhere with. I didn't stop at the cave entrance, though. I dashed through the dark forest, throwing my gun down in the cave before I bolted out, and I didn't stop until I had reached the road. I don't know how I made it back to the road. I didn't think about where I was going whatsoever, only that I had to escape, only that I had to live. Soon enough, I could see the banner-like wooden sign that indicated I was nearing Bullensmith. But as I crossed the boundary, I was to find yet another horror awaiting me there. The town was gone. Just as it had erased itself from my memory, so too had it been scrubbed clean from the earth, and in its place sat an empty plot of land, vacant of tree or brush or grass. When I returned to Portshire, I told them what I had found, and they had looked at me like a raving madman. The man who had offered me the bounty had said, "You're off your rocker. I've never heard of a village called Bullensmith in my life." Nobody in Portshire had heard of Bullensmith. I sprinted crazily from man to woman to child, grabbing their shoulders and shouting in their faces, "Do you know the village Bullensmith?" And the shakes of their heads and accusatory expressions which hung on their faces never became less maddening. They were expressions which accused me of being drunk or delirious. They didn't need to speak for me to know what those expressions meant. There is no Bullensmith. I remember the look that formed on my face as the thought pierced me as a dagger does flesh. Though I could not see it, I remember it with great detail. It was the look of a shattered mind. It was the look of someone whose entire concept of reality had been rejected. As I raved onward, they all became increasingly convinced of my unsound mind, and I was eventually thrown into a madhouse, where I remain. I'm not mad, though. I'm perfectly sane, and I am perfectly aware. I didn't see a creature in that cave that night. Of this I have no doubt, because what I saw was far more dreadful than a beast with dripping fangs. What I saw was the true state of eternity. I saw the great void, and it saw me too. It waits for me in death, the bitter, indifferent embrace of nothing, awaiting my arrival to consume me, as it does us all.